Hi, this is Steve Dale with the Golden State Pool Trust here, and today we're really fortunate to have Jim Huyck here to talk about the basics of regional centers. Okay, for those of you that are watching at home, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions later. So Amy is monitoring your questions on the chat, but we will be taking questions at the end of the formal presentation, and we do encourage questions. For those of you that are doing this for MCLE credit here, if you're an attorney or if you're a trustee here, this program's been approved for 1 unit of MCLE credit by the State Bar of California. Each section of this program has a code that the viewer will need to record to verify participation in the class. If you want to receive MCLE credit, then you can download the MCLE credit form and fill out the proper codes at that time. Also, if you need any assistance at all, you can email Amy, which is AMY, at gspt.org. Okay, so with that, let me give you just a little introduction here. Jim has been working over 40 years with persons with disabilities with a real focus on developmental disabilities. He began his career as a senior rehabilitation counselor with the California Department of Rehabilitation, working with regional center clients. After 5 years, he was hired by the San Diego Community College District as a counselor for the limited learners, which were regional center clients. He was promoted to Associate Dean of Special Education at San Diego Community College District, where he served until he was recruited to Sacramento by the California Community College Chancellor's Office, where he launched the statewide foundation for California community colleges. During his tenure there, he was successful in obtaining grants and contracts totaling over $17 million per year, including funding from Apple and IBM to establish high-tech centers for the disabled at community colleges statewide. In 1995, he was hired as the executive director of Alta Regional Center, where he served for over 10 years, managing a staff of over 300 employees and an annual budget of $175 million. For the past 12 years, he has been consulting and advocating for individuals with disabilities and their families to assist in accessing public benefits, including regional center benefits, SSI, SSDI, Medi-Cal, IHSS, special education, CCS, etc. And I'm sure there's probably some on top of that. And particularly, he works closely with attorneys and trustees as a consultant regarding special needs trusts here. And he has served as an expert witness in a number of civil lawsuits. I know for myself, when I had learned that Jim was leaving the regional center system, I made a beeline up to meet Jim, as you might remember here, because, you know, once again, regional center services, and what we're going to learn from this is the importance of the IPP, and really being prepared for the IPP is just about everything when we're looking for services. And, you know, what I had talked to Jim about was that, you know, what he has done would be so helpful if he worked in the private sector. And I can tell you, he has no equal out there at this point. We use him a lot for a lot of our clients. So I know we're going to learn a lot today here. And I want to welcome you, Jim, and thank you for sharing your knowledge with us.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. And welcome to everybody online and everyone who's here. And again, thank you to the Golden State Pool Trust. Just to add a little bit to my biography, also my wife's brother was a consumer of the regional center, so we've sat on both sides of the table, of the IPP table. Let's start off with, there was a slide here that Steve had talked about that talks about how you can receive credit for this, and I apparently will be giving codes throughout this that you folks will need in order to receive that credit. Let's begin with where regional centers came about. There was a time in California and in a lot of states where people with developmental disabilities were housed in institutions. State hospitals, they were called in California. Developmental centers, they're called now. There were family members who, and in fact even my own brother-in-law, my wife tells me the stories of how her folks were told that Chuck should be put into an institution. and should not be kept with the family and raised along with the other siblings. Her father and her mother resisted that, and Chuck was raised within the family and was immensely more socialized and became much more of a full personality-wise rather than being in an institution. But what happened back in the 60s is those family members who had their loved ones at the institutions said there's got to be a better way. There's got to be a way to provide services to individuals with developmental disabilities in the community, not in state hospitals. And the families literally would follow Frank Lannerman, which the regional center legislation is named after. They'd follow Frank Lannerman over to the senator office building, and they would follow him up in the elevator and literally pound on his desk because he was the head of the budget committee under the Reagan administration. And basically said we need to have more community-based services. We need to have a way for people who are in institutions to come out, be with their families, and receive services in the community. Frank Lannerman had no idea who these people were. He learned very quickly who they were, though, and interestingly enough, he held hostage the budget until there was an agreement that there would be 2 pilot regional centers set up, one in Los Angeles, which has now become Lannerman Regional Center, and one in San Francisco, which is Golden Gate Regional Center. Those were the 2 original regional centers that were pilots, and they only served people with what was called mental retardation in those days, not the broader definition that we'll get into as far as what the regional centers serve. So the 2, to make a long story short, the 2 pilots were very successful and now have expanded to 21 regional centers across the state, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But they were originally developed as a mechanism to provide a community-based alternative to institutional care. The primary goals of the regional center are to provide the services and supports necessary to allow children with developmental disabilities to remain with their families and for adults to achieve the highest level of normalization possible. So let's talk about the definition for regional center eligibility, which is important. Developmental disability, first of all, it has to originate prior to the age of 18. Now, I've got a lot of cases coming to me where the individual is over 18. In fact, when I ran a regional center, we would occasionally find someone or be referred someone that was maybe in their 40s and 50s, and families would wonder, well, it's too late because we didn't apply prior to age 18. No, the developmental disability must have occurred prior to age 18. Now, it becomes difficult sometimes to document that because we have to go back in time to special ed records. But as long as the person was developmentally disabled prior to the age of 18. Now, there were some folks that we served, and we'll get into the definition a little bit more in a moment, that the injury occurred at age 18 or 19. It could be a head injury. We couldn't serve those people, which is really, really unfortunate. They had the same disabilities as those who were eligible, but because it occurred after the age of 18, it's no longer considered a developmental disability. Now, the other important part of the definition to be eligible for regional center is that it must be expected to continue indefinitely and constitutes a substantial disability, and we'll go into what that means. Here's your first code. The MCLE code number 1 is 1539, so you'll want to make a note of that to get credit. Okay, so let's go a little bit deeper into the definition of developmental disability for regional center purposes. Regional centers serve folks with intellectual disabilities, no longer called mental retardation, intellectual disabilities, cerebral palsy, seizure disorders or epilepsy, and autism. There also is another category that is what is called the 5th category. It's sort of the famous 5th category that people who have needs similar to those with an intellectual disability can be found eligible for regional center services. This would be someone who had a head injury. We used to have a lot of sports injuries, or people who dove in the swimming pools and injured themselves, or shotgun wounds, that sort of thing. But again, it had to be prior to the age of 18. And the disability cannot be solely physical except for the cerebral palsy. So there's a limitation in who can be eligible, It cannot be, and I think I have it on the next, actually, the disability cannot be due to mental health solely. In other words, if the person's diagnosis is a mental health disability, regional centers do not serve that population. However, a person can have a developmental disability and also a mental health disability. So you can have a situation where a person is duly diagnosed. Now, what becomes difficult many times in actually serving an individual like that is that we sometimes have to determine, you know, which disability is it that's causing the person the functional issues and the services that they need. We would many times have quite interesting discussions with the mental health agency in our counties, the 10 counties that we serve, as to whether this is an individual that should be served by mental health or should be served by the regional center if they had the dual diagnosis. Again, the disability must have originated prior to the age of 18, and then this is the second part of the definition that a lot of people don't understand, and that is that it must constitute a substantial disability in a minimum of 3 of the following areas. Now, this is for an adult, so someone over the age of 18. Communication, learning, self-care, mobility, self-direction, capacity for independent living, and economic self-sufficiency. Now, going back a number of years when the Lanterman Act was first written and the W&I Code, the Welfare and Institutions Code, was written, it didn't specifically say there had to be 3 of the 7. So we had some regional centers that if the person had 2 areas of substantial disability, they were made eligible. Some were 3, some were 4, and it was real inconsistent across the whole state. So they changed the regulations that it is a minimum of 3. Now again, that's for an individual that's over the age of 18, because we can include capacity for independent living and economic self-sufficiency. For a child, someone between the ages of 3 and 18, you're going to have 3 of 5, because you're not going to have capacity for independent living and economic self-sufficiency. So it almost becomes more difficult for someone between the age of 3 and 18 to become eligible, because they only have 5 areas of which they must be substantially disabled in 3 of those. Now, we sometimes have a situation where someone will come to us and they're maybe 16 and 17 and they've only got 2. They've got the disability, but it's not resulting in a substantial disability functional limitation in 3 of 5 areas. So we sometimes have to even wait until the person turns 18, because then that gives us the other 2 categories, the capacity for independent living and economic self-sufficiency. Economic self-sufficiency, by the way, is the ability to work and to earn a living. So once they turn 18, if they can't live independently and they can't earn a living, then those are 2 additional areas that we can get the 3 of 7 out of. Okay, the Department of Developmental Services is the mothership for the regional centers. They are the state agency through which the dollars flow out to the 21 regional centers. And regional centers are nonprofit organizations. Many people think of them as state agencies. They're not. They receive all of their funding from the state, and they have contracts with the state. They're 5-year contracts that are renewed, and the regional centers negotiate those contracts basically as one entity. So there's not 21 different negotiations going on. There are 21 regional centers across the state with more than 40 offices. The regional center I ran, we had 10 counties and we had 7 offices. We were about the 3rd largest. The regional center East Bay here is, I think, about equal to what Alta was. Largest regional center is down in Southern California with Inland Regional Center. What's important here is that the eligibility criteria, there is no financial test. A lot of the benefits that I work with families, they're means tested. The individual can't have more than $2,000, or they have to have limited income. With the regional centers, there is no financial test at all. Okay? There are some fees, however, that have creeped into the entitlement that families are charged for services for their children if the child is not on Medi-Cal. So there's I'm not sure I have a slide for it, but there's an annual fee that families are charged, $200 if they're receiving services. There's also a parental responsibility that if the child is placed into a residential facility, depending upon what the income is of the family will be charged for that residential placement. Unfortunately, sometimes the Department of Developmental Services is not real current with charging those families. I have father call me and say, I just got this bill for $20,000 from the state of California. My child was placed into a residential facility. And I had to explain to him where that was coming from, the parental responsibility for that child's residential placement. Depending upon, again, what his income was, then he was charged for that placement. Along those same lines, regional centers take into account what's called parental responsibility. So in looking at what services the regional center is going to provide, the regional center is going to look at what are the responsibilities that a parent would have for a child of a similar age that was not disabled. So many times parents are asking for particular services, but those are services that, or those are needs that are met by parents with a non-disabled child. So under the regulations, the regional center can't provide services that the parents would be responsible for providing if the child was not disabled. The other, like most agencies, regional centers are to be what's called payer of last resort, which means that the regional center is to pursue all other funding sources before they get their checkbook out. That could be generic agencies such as, well, private insurance, education, Medi-Cal, in-home support services. We had an interesting situation not too many years ago. For those of you who are aware of special needs trusts that are set up for children, we had a regional center that said, oh, this child has a special needs trust. And the special needs trust lists all of these types of things that the trust can pay for. Regional center said, we're not paying for anything. So we appealed that, and we had to appeal it and go all the way up in front of an administrative law judge, and the judge did a great job. We say that because he ruled in our favor, but he wrote a really great decision stating that while the regional centers are to be payer of last resort after generic agencies, the legislature did not intend that they would be pay after a special needs trust does. So in other words, the regional center in that case had to pay for services. It was respite, and they had to pay for it before the trust would pay for it. So every once in a while, we'll get a regional center that'll take the same position, saying that the special needs trust should pay, and I get a copy of the judge's decision, and we send that over to the supervisor, and we've been able to push back on that. Regional centers provide services through a network of vendors. I think sometimes people think the regional centers are actually providing the service, but they provide the services through vendors. The only services that the regional centers provide is case finding, eligibility, and case management. All other services that are provided by the regional centers are done through vendors, hundreds and hundreds of vendors that the regional centers have that have agreed to accept the payment from the regional center, and that payment is usually set at a state rate. So the regional centers don't have control. And I know everyone's very upset with how much vendors are paid, and that it's not enough, and they're not able to keep staff, and there's terrible turnover. The regional centers can only pay what the state allows them to pay. So it becomes difficult sometimes for services to be available to individuals to meet the needs. In the old days, we used to have money to do resource development. If we needed a 6-bed facility for our consumers, we could actually give an entity $10,000 or $20,000 to do a startup to get that board and care home going. Now there's no funds for that type of resource development. So again, the regional centers have to be reliant upon their vendors. The vendors have to submit to the regional center a program design. They have to talk about what the services they're going to provide, what staff's going to provide the service, the qualifications of the staff, the training the staff's going to receive, and all of that has to be done in advance before the regional center is approving that vendor to receive state monies for providing services. Okay, so persons with developmental disabilities, and they are called consumers, they're entitled to a broad range of services. Now, everyone always says, well, there's an entitlement, what they're entitled to. With my brother-in-law, Chuck, my wife and her sisters would say, okay, where's the menu of all the items that Chuck is entitled to? The entitlement is what's in the IPP. So we'll talk about the whole development of the IPP, but what the consumer is entitled to is what has been agreed to in the IPP, the individual program plan. For those of you that are familiar with education, there's the individual educational plan, the IEP. With Department of Rehabilitation, there's the IPE, the individual plan for employment. So everybody's got their own terminology, but with regional centers, the entitlement is what is in the IPP. The underlying philosophy is to provide services that allow a consumer's life to approximate that of his or her same-age non-disabled peers. Regional center consumers are assigned a case manager, or sometimes they're called service coordinators. Different regional centers call them different things, who work with the individual and his or her family or caregivers to develop a coordinated plan to achieve maximum independence. Now, regional centers used to have caseloads of about, the regional center workers had caseloads of about 65 or so. Those caseloads have increased and increased and increased. They're up to 90 and 100. It's difficult many times to get a hold of your worker, but because they do have the large caseloads and they do have the responsibility of annual reviews and doing IPPs either on a 1, 2, or 3 year cycle. So sometimes it is difficult to reach your case manager because their caseloads are getting larger all the time. Now, the services can vary from one center to another. The philosophy behind the regional centers when they were established, they should be very much community-based, and they should reflect what the needs of that particular community are. So if you go to downtown Los Angeles or you go to Golden Gate in downtown San Francisco, the regional center and the services provided may look a whole lot different than if you go to Kern County. You know, you're going to have situations in the rural areas where there's just not enough consumers for a vendor to make a go of it, to make a business of it. So sometimes those regional centers have to become a little more creative in how they actually provide services, maybe what's called PA, personal assistance services, maybe through some customized kinds of services. You just don't have the critical mass in some of the rural areas that you do. In the LA area, you've got 5 regional centers. Those regional centers all tend to look very much alike because you could have an individual consumer move across the street and they would be in a different catchment area, a different regional center area. So those regional centers and execs have agreed that they're going to operate pretty much all the same, use the same vendors, so that there's not a difficulty when someone moves in the LA area. Now, a consumer can move from one part of the state to another part of the state, and the IPP is to follow them. In other words, the regional center, the services that were agreed to in the original regional center, those services are to be honored by the receiving regional center until a new IPP can be written, and those services are to be provided the best they can be in the new regional center. It could be that there's not a vendor that provides that same service. But that's why it'd be important to call for an IPP meeting immediately upon moving to a new area so that you could review the services that were in the original IPP and how those services can be provided in the new regional center or other services developed to meet the needs of the consumer. Let's go on. The consumer really should have a leadership role in putting together their IPP. It's supposed to be person-centered. There's supposed to be choices that the regional center honors that the consumer is making. And the consumer should participate in all of the decisions. Now, what's interesting about the Lanterman Act and the Welfare and Institutions Code that was written as a result of the legislation is there's internal conflict within the legislation and the W&I code itself. There's portions of the W&I code, Welfare and Institutions Code, that talks about consumer choice. There's also parts of the W&I code that talk about cost effectiveness. So you could have a situation where a consumer wants one thing, the regional center is saying we can meet that need another way and with less cost. So you could have a situation where let's say the family or the regional center wants service X, and the regional center looks at the cost of that, looks at what the need is, and the regional center may say, no, we will meet that need through Y. And that could result, and we'll talk a little bit about the fair hearing process in a moment. But that's just an example of where there is an emphasis on consumer choice, but it can sometimes be only to the point that the regional center agrees that that is a cost-effective way of meeting the needs, that particular need of the consumer. Okay, we are up to MCLE code, LE code number 2, and it's 2681. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit more about the IPP planning team. Technically, the IPP team can if it's an adult, can consist of 2 people, the consumer and a representative from the regional center. However, there can be a whole lot more people on the IPP planning team. When I was executive director, there were times when it was a pretty high-profile IPP, and there could be a room full of as many people as we have here, 20 people or so. The family and the consumer can invite to the IPP meeting whomever they want, and it's important for those people that best know the consumer to attend the IPP meeting. So you could have family members, you could have friends, neighbors, co-workers. It's important that the service providers that are currently providing services to that consumer be there to provide that input. Any support persons, and again, any individual invited by the consumer or the authorized representative. Now, the regional center can also invite who they want. They can invite the clinical staff, they can invite other supervisors, chief counselors, whoever. And that's good. You know, I work with a lot of families, and many times one of the first things, if there's an issue going on, that I say is, let's call for an IPP meeting. You know, let's get everybody together, get it all on the table, let's look at what the problems are. Usually when they hear the former executive director of a regional center is coming, the service coordinator will invite their supervisor, and sometimes even the chief counselor, the level above. And I always think that's a very good thing, because those folks can many times have a little more juice and can make decisions and provide possibly more creative ways of meeting a consumer's needs, or maybe resolving some issues that have developed over time. So that's one of the pluses, I believe, when an advocate becomes involved in the process. So the required components of an IPP. Everything that the regional center does and provides is done through assessed need. So again, sometimes people will say, and my own family members said, okay, again, where's the list of services that Chuck is entitled to? Well, you don't work that way. So what does Chuck need? You know, what are the needs? Does he need someone to help him live independently? Does he need someone to help him be successful on a job? Then the regional center and the IPP team looks at how to meet that need. It also involves, obviously, the consumer's goals, their preferences, their capabilities, their strengths, barriers, concerns, problems, general health status, expected outcomes. An IPP really is a document that contains all aspects of the consumer's life, even those areas that the regional center is not going to be paying for anything. But the case management responsibility of the regional center is to look at all of those areas, such as health. You know, are they seeing the doctor? Are they seeing the dentist? Are there other issues going on in the consumer's life? So it's really a comprehensive document that the regional center case worker looks at their entire life and all aspects of the life. Obviously, within the IPP are the goals and the objectives, and then lastly, the services and supports, whether that be coming from the regional center or whether that be coming from another agency. So let's talk a little bit about the types of services that the regional center provides. We'll back up a little bit here to talk about the two programs that regional centers operate, and many times people don't understand this. The regional center operates what's called the Early Start or the Early Intervention Program. That is not under the Lanterman Act. That is a program that is funded through education, and it's for ages 0 to 3. And it serves a very broad category of individuals, youngsters, 0 to 3, who are in danger of becoming diagnosed or having a diagnosis of a developmental disability if they don't have early intervention services. So there's infant stimulation, there's early intervention. Usually what this consists of is occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy in the home, which is really neat. It's not, you know, at some site. The services are actually provided in the consumer's home. Now, at age 3, there has to be a determination as to whether that child is developmentally disabled and meets that definition that we went through. And when I ran a regional center, and most of the regional centers are this way, only about 1/3 of the kids that are served in the early intervention program go on to become eligible for what we call over 3 services under the Lanterman Act. So you've got 2/3 of those families who have been getting these great services, OT, PT, and speech, then all of a sudden, regional center goes away. And unfortunately, I have found some families that never understand that there is service, that regional centers provide services over the age of 3. Some of the families, that's all they do, because at age 3, the regional centers pass the family and the consumer, the youngster, the 3-year-old, over to the school system at that point. I've had families that have said, God, we were never even told that there was a possibility that our child maybe could have over 3 services. And remember, once you're eligible for over 3 services, you're eligible for services for the rest of your life. So it's the real ticket. So sometimes I'll get a referral and the child will be 4 or 5, and I'll say, well, what happened at age 3? Did the regional center take a look at whether, you know, Johnny was eligible? And they'll say, no, we didn't hear anything. All we had was a meeting where education was invited to the meeting, and the regional center said, I'd like to introduce you to education. Technically, there should be a decision made, an eligibility decision made, and a right to appeal that at age 3. So families should be fully informed that their child has gone through a process of being found either eligible or not eligible for those over 3 services. So critical point in that process. So what else do regional centers do? For the over 3 population, one of the big services, as I said before, is case management. For adults, there are adult day programs. Those adult day programs can be either community-based or they can be site-based. However, more and more the philosophy, of course, is to have services provided in the community. Behavior management programs. Regional centers can pay for behavior management programs. Many of those programs require that the parents first go through a training. It's a parent training model. So the parents are first trained on applied behavior analysis or behavior modification, and then the regional center will have a behavioral specialist come in and do an assessment of the individuals, the consumer's behaviors, come up with a plan to address those behaviors, and then train the individuals in that consumer's life, whether that be the parents or the support people or whatever, in how to implement that behavioral plan. Another very large service that the regional center pays for, 2 of them I'll talk about together, is independent living skills training and supported living services. This is for adults, and this is for individuals who have as a goal to be living out on their own. So the regional center can provide, again, either independent living skills training, referred to as ILS, or supported living services, SLS. The difference between the two is that if an individual can learn the skill, let's say, to live independently, then they can be taught that skill through independent living skills training. But at some point, there's going to be some skills they're just not going to be able to learn. Whether it be, paying the bills or whatever, cooking, laundry, whatever it is, they can't learn to do that skill to the degree necessary to live successfully. Then supported living services kick in. Supported living services are a service where the regional center pays an agency for staff to support the consumer living independently at whatever level and for as many hours as necessary, and that service can go on for his lifetime, for the lifetime of that consumer. So again, the ILS, the Independent Living Skills Training, is, as his name implies, you're training the individual on the skills that they need to live independently. Supported living services are those areas that the consumer is never going to learn that skill and therefore going to need ongoing support for the rest of their life. So for instance, in my brother-in-law's case, Chuck was living independently. He was living in the house that his parents had left. They had passed away. Chuck needed someone to make sure he got up in the morning, got dressed, got a good breakfast, got out the door, got to the bus, to his job, and then the supported living services staff person would be there in the evening when Chuck gets back, make sure he cooked, got his clothes ready for the next day, and so he had like 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the afternoon. Now there's some consumers that need 24-hour-a-day services, and you can imagine that it's extremely expensive, and so regional centers take a very close look at providing SLS for 24 hours a day. Now when I ran a regional center, we had about 250 people on SLS, and some of those people needed 24/7, and some of those people needed 2-on-1 24/7, and we provided that. Very expensive. Some of those are as much as $250,000 a year. So you can see when someone says, what's the entitlement? You know, you can have a person maybe getting a little bit of respite, and you have another person getting $250,000. So there can be quite a difference in the entitlement as far as what an individual actually receives. Now the regional center can also pay for what's called the traditional board and care home, community care licensed home, 6-bed facilities that are at various levels. The regional center funds residential facilities at what's called levels 2, 3, and 4, and the levels indicate the need of the consumer. So if you have a consumer that doesn't have a whole lot of behavioral needs, they would be in a level 2. If they had behavioral issues and they needed a richer staffing ratio at the board and care home, that would be a level 4. Regional centers can fund up to level 4I. Now the funding for that is the funding for that residential facility is a combination of the SSI or the SSDI that the adult is receiving, and then the regional center supplements it. So the board and care home could be let's say $5,000 a month. Individuals getting about $1,100 on their SSI. The regional center picks up the balance of that, $3,900 or whatever it is. So it's a very expensive item for regional centers. It was one of the biggest ticket items in our budget, was for board and care, because that board and care again is going to go on for the rest of that individual's life. And so so it's a combination again of funding from the SSI or SSDI that they're on, and the regional center. Mobility training would be, regional centers can pay for mobility training if there's a reason that the consumer needs to get from point A to point B, and they are capable of learning how to do that using public transportation, then the regional center can do mobility training, pay for a vendor to teach the consumer to use the buses, and that's either called destination training or mobility training. There are a couple other services that are really cool. One is supported employment. Now this gets a little more complicated. With supported employment, there's an agreement between the regional center and the Department of Rehabilitation. So if we have a consumer who is interested in becoming employed, we refer them over to the Department of Rehabilitation. Department of Rehabilitation goes through their usual process of finding the person eligible, maybe doing some needs testing or some aptitude and interest testing, comes up with a vocational goal with the consumer, and then helps the consumer find a job. Well, that job may be a job that the consumer can't do unless they've got help. And so the Department of Rehab can pay a supported employment agency for a job coach. So again, getting back to my brother-in-law Chuck, he worked at the Carlsbad Military Academy in the food service. Marriott ran the food service operation, so he was an employee of Marriott working at the military academy in the kitchen. but he needed a job coach. And so the Department of Rehab paid for that job coach. And then the Department of Rehab, if they can withdraw that job coach down to 0, then they close the case. I was a rehab counselor. They were called 26s. So it's a successful rehab. Chuck's working on the job. He doesn't need a job coach. However, Chuck needed to have that job coach on an ongoing basis. So the funding for that job coach, for the support employment service, transitions over to the regional center. The regional center for that service for the rest of Chuck's life. So it's really, really cool. But it's a bit of a network to navigate through the Department of Rehab and then also through the regional center. But that's how support employment works. Respite is one of the probably the most valued service that the regional centers provide to their consumers. That gives the family a break from the mental and the physical responsibility of providing care for their family member, for their consumer. Regional centers fund respite through respite agencies. Now, there was recently a change in the legislation as of January. It's not all widely known, but up until January, the maximum amount of respite that a regional center could provide for what's called in-home respite was 90 hours per quarter or 30 hours a month, unless there was an exceptional situation. Exceptional situation being if the child doesn't, or if the individual didn't have respite and give the family a break, then the consumer is going to have to be placed into a residential facility. Well, the philosophy is to keep families together, so they would make an exception there. If it was so severe that the parents were going to divorce, for instance, then maybe there can be an exception made and there'd be more than 90 hours. However, as of January, the legislation changed, and no longer does there have to be an exception to exceed that 90 hours. Now, 90 hours per quarter. Now, regional centers can still have their own guidelines on how many hours and their own assessment tools to determine how many hours of respite they give a family. But there's no longer in legislation the need for an exception for that 90 hours per quarter to be exceeded, and also for out-of-home respite, the 21 days of out-of-home respite that can be provided for families. Out-of-home respite is provided primarily through the consumer staying at a board and care home. So to the extent that you've got board and care homes that have empty beds, and until they fill that bed, they say, hey, we will do out-of-home placement, regional center, if you've got consumers that want to have the consumer stay with us for a weekend or for a week or whatever, the family can have a break. And again, that 21 days used to be the maximum unless there was an exception, but as of January, there's no longer that requirement. Yeah, we'll just hold questions till the end. Therapy services, the regional center primarily turns to generic resources for therapy, such as OT, PT, and speech. If it's a child, that would be California Children's Services. It would also be the educational system. There can be occasions where the regional center can pay for therapy, but again, they're payer of last resort, and there would have to be shown an indication that it was a needed service and that no other generic resource could provide it. Transportation, the regional centers can pay for door-to-door service for adult day programs. They also can pay for training someone to use the bus if that's a way that they if that's a way the consumer can get from point A to point B. They can pay for a bus pass. Transportation can be provided, for instance, by the day program, or the regional center vendorizes separate transportation agencies to do transportation. There's a relatively new service called Tailored Day Services that is for those consumers that just don't fit into the traditional day program model. A day program is 6 hours a day, 5 days a week. But there are some consumers, primarily some of the higher functioning consumers, that don't fit in. They don't fit into the population. They don't fit into their needs being met that way. They may just want some hours during the month for someone to be with them, maybe to take a community college enrichment class of some sort. It may not be an academic class because maybe they can't handle that, but it could be a class that they're interested in, a local community college. They need someone to go with them. so that they could have that. They may want to do some volunteer work in the community. So the regional center, again, through vendors, would pay for a staff person to go with the consumer to do those activities. And that's all under what's called tailored day services. Okay, there is a process that is used for making consumers of the regional center who are children eligible for Medi-Cal. And this gets a little complicated. It's through a process called institutional deeming by placing the child onto one of the Medicaid waiver programs. Okay, so you say, well, why is it important that the child be on Medi-Cal? Well, Medi-Cal can provide health insurance for that child. Medi-Cal will make the child eligible to apply for in-home support services. And also, if the child's on Medi-Cal, there are no fees charged to the family from the regional center, except that parental responsibility one, the one I talked about for the family being responsible for a residential placement. So usually when a child is being considered for Medi-Cal, the parent's income is what's called, the parent's income and resources are deemed to the child. That means that if the family has more than about $3,000, if the family has a decent income, then that's going to be considered the resource and income of the child, and the child's not going to be eligible for Medi-Cal. So there's a process through the regional center under what's called the DDS waiver. That stands for Department of Developmental Services. It's one of the home and community-based Medicaid waiver programs where the child is assessed and has to have certain deficits, which most of the consumers meet in terms of functioning. The child is placed onto the DDS waiver by the regional center, and then the regional center asks the local county Medi-Cal agency to institutionally deem the child on the Medi-Cal by only looking at the child's income and resources, not the parents. So it's a bit of a complicated process, but that's the process by which we can get regional center consumers, children who would otherwise be not eligible for Medi-Cal, we can get them onto Medi-Cal. Now, in some states, being on a Medicaid waiver program is the difference between receiving services and not receiving services. I had a family that was in the Bay Area, moved back to Atlanta, Georgia, and this young man was receiving all sorts of services from the regional center here at Golden Gate. He was in a day program, he was getting some behavioral services, the family was getting respite, he was getting transportation. Moved to Atlanta, nothing. He was put on a waiting list for the waiver. In a lot of states, if you're on the waiver, on the Medicaid waiver program, you get services, and if you're not, you don't get services. In California, being on the waiver does not make any difference in terms of the services that you receive from a regional center. I have many families that really sort of overthink the waiver. And it's true the waiver helps get the child eligible for Medi-Cal, but it has nothing to do with receiving or not receiving services in the state of California. In other states, it's the difference between receiving services and not receiving services. So it's really a big difference in California. There are times when there are disagreements between a family and or a consumer and the regional center in terms of a service that's requested, and the regional center may, in their wisdom, say, no, we don't feel that service is needed, and we are not going to provide it. So the regional center has to provide what's called a notice of action. Technically, the family can really ask for a notice of action on anything that the regional center says no to. It could be the change of a service coordinator. They no longer want that service coordinator. It could be because of a service that the regional center denied, but the regional center can or should issue a notice of action that states that the service is not going to be provided, the reason it's not going to be provided, and the right of the consumer and the family to appeal that. So if the service is already in place and the family gets the appeal in within 10 days, then there is what's called aid paid pending. So the service continues. So let's say that the the service was that the respite is no longer going to be provided at 30 hours a month for whatever reason, then there could be a notice of action issued by the regional center, and if the family appeals that within 10 days, then that 30 hours a month of respite continues until the appeal is decided. There are different levels of appeal. The first one is called the informal meeting. That's where the family would, and I sit in on a lot of these, is we would meet with the regional center with another person at the regional center that would relook at why the regional center denied the services and whether or not it should be overturned. The next level up is what's called mediation, and that is in front of an administrative law judge, the same judges that listen to the formal fair hearing, which is the third level, but with mediation, they don't make a decision. They try to get the families to voluntarily agree to resolve the issue. So we've had some situations with supported living, for instance, where the regional center said, we're not going to pay for this amount of supported living services, these number of hours. And we say, well, the consumer needs this many. So we go into an informal, and we go before the judge, and then the judge sort of does, shuttle diplomacy, put us each in a room and say, okay, well, if you'll agree to this, will they agree to that, and try to come up with a resolution. If that doesn't work, and by the way, that's voluntary on the part of either party. So either party can say, we're not going to do mediation. Or even after they go through the process of trying to work something out, they can say, no, never mind, we'll see you in front of the judge. We're not going to abide by anything that we might be able to mediate. And then it goes to formal fair hearing, and that is in front of a judge. And that's where it's like a court of law. There's the introduction of evidence through the questioning of witnesses and the presentation of documents, and then a judge makes a decision as to whether the appeal should be upheld or not. Okay, it looks like we are to a code 9341, which I believe is the last code, and probably have time for some questions.
You have applied for regional center services when your disabled adult dependent was 27 years old, and services were denied, and at that point in time you did not, as a parent, have the strength nor the dollars, the financial wherewithal
To appeal that.
to appeal that. Can you appeal that later, and how do you go about it?
Yeah, it wouldn't be an appeal because after 30 days you can't appeal that decision, but you can reapply for services.
I see.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, certainly. I think the question.
Oh, sorry. Oh, okay.
The question was if you applied for services for an adult child at age 27 and the regional center denied eligibility, can you still appeal that? And my answer would be no, you can't appeal that particular decision because 30 days has lapsed and you didn't appeal it within 30 days. But you could reapply. And like I said before, you don't have to apply for services when the individual is prior to age 18. The developmental disability must have occurred prior to the age of 18. So if I'm the regional center and I'm in the intake unit and I see this application come in, I look in the file and, hey, we already denied this person at age 27 and they're now 32 or whatever, I would want to see new information. If I don't see new information that would document that the person was disabled prior to the age of 18, then the decision is not going to change. But let's say during that time, like you say, you didn't have the time or the energy or the resources to fight it, if you can present new information, maybe there's a psychologist that tested the individual prior to the age of 18, you have an IQ score, maybe there was some doctor records, maybe there's special education records that you didn't have the first time. You would need to gather those and reapply. It wouldn't be an appeal, it'd be a reapplication for services.
Okay. And what type of assistance would you have to garner to have the successful application process?
Next slide. There you go. Oh, thank you. I'm not quite sure. You need to present the information.
I mean, i.e., would I need to hire you as an advocate
Not.
and an attorney?
Well, I wouldn't hire an attorney right away. Sorry, Steve. By the way, I'm a great believer in getting things resolved at the lowest level possible. For me, the lowest level possible is the IPP meeting, and then you go through the fair hearing process. And in the 12 years I've been doing this, we've had to go to fair hearing like less than 2 times, I think. We get things resolved. I would think that you would want to hire someone like me to consult with you to be sure that you're gathering everything you need that you can possibly gather to present to the regional center. Now, if there's new information, the regional center is going to base their decision on that new information. If there's not new information, it doesn't matter who you hire. It's not going to make a difference because it's going to be based upon what you can gather. Regional centers used to accept a phone call from me, for instance, saying, I've got a family I'm working with. I'd like to shoot you over the psych report, have your clinical team take a look at it. They won't do that anymore. It's got to come from the family if it's a child, or it has to come from the individual. So I would not be able to, let's say you made that decision to reapply, I certainly would consult with you, make sure we've gotten all the documentation we possibly can. But you and your adult child actually would have to make the application. Now, if you have a conservatorship, then regional centers will honor that. But otherwise, it does have to come from the consumer. Because regional center consumer services are voluntary. The individual has to agree that they want those services. So I'm not sure, did I answer your question? Or?
Yeah, pretty much. The last part of this
Okay.
is the last part of my question, excuse me for having a 3-part question, is when the application happened, in this case, my son is dependent. When he was 27 years old, we had a complete psychological testing. Don't you have to repeat that?
Okay, that's a very good point. If I'm the regional center and I've received a psych report that was done at the age of 27, that is not evidence. That's not evidence of the developmental disability occurring prior to the age of 18. I need to have a psych report that was done prior to the age of 18. Now, you can make the argument, and sometimes we've been successful, that if IQ is pretty stable over time. So if you can get an IQ score, and by the way, for intellectual disability qualifications for regional center, it's an IQ of 70 or below on the WAIS, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Test. If you have 70 or below, you've got a pretty good shot at it. If you do a test of an individual at age 27 and they get a 50 on the WAIS, I think we have a pretty good argument that he probably was developmentally disabled prior to the age of 18. If we get a score that's in the 70s at age 27, it's going to be, unless you've got some other documentation prior to the age of 18, it's going to be pretty tough to make the argument that that person should be eligible.
Any other questions?
Other questions?
Okay. So you said that parents are responsible for fees that can occur. So my understanding was that there's a clawback. So when that person dies, whatever money they have, that would pay for services rendered while they were living. So it is a little concerning to hear that I could get a bill possibly for ILS services based on my son living on his own right now.
No, the regional center does not do a clawback.
Oh, so that would just be like DOR.
DO, as far as I know, Department of Rehabilitation doesn't do a clawback. Medi-Cal will do a clawback, particularly if the consumer has a special needs trust, a first-party special needs trust. Then any services that are provided and paid for by Medi-Cal, including regional center services, including in-home support services, including Medi-Cal, then those services can be asked to be reimbursed. Medi-Cal can be asked to be reimbursed for those. Regional centers don't ask for reimbursement.
Okay. And then I have another question about mobility training.
Yeah.
So you said public transportation,
Yep.
bus passes, and all that fun stuff. But there are some adult children who could possibly drive. Would Regional Center help with driver's education, or is that really pushing
well,
it?
what we immediately would do is let's look at the situation. Why does he or she need to drive a car? Is it to get to a job? If it's a job, are they hooked up with Department of Rehab? Department of Rehab will pay for that. Regional centers will usually not pay for driver's education because, again, it gets back to, okay, where's the person needing to get to and what's the most cost-effective way for them to get there? And it could be just taking a bus and buying a bus pass rather than paying for public transportation. Now, I will say there are situations, I know the regional centers don't always like me to say this, but there are situations where we just cannot think of any other way to get a consumer from point A to point B. We had taxi companies vendorized, and we would use taxis. I mean, there was just no getting around it. It wasn't a long-term solution because it's very expensive. There would be times when there would need to be emergency housing for consumers. Again, we had motels that were vendorized. We could pay motels for very short-term emergency stays. But again, that's not a long-term. So there's lots of services that the regional centers in a pinch can provide, but they're not used heavily and they're only for very short-term emergency situations.
And I have one last question.
Yeah.
So if my adult child says, I don't want services anymore, does that mean he can never have them again? Or can
Good
he
point.
say,
Good point.
boy, I made a big mistake. I really
Yeah,
need your help.
and it's not a mistake. That's a good question. The regional center can, at the request of the parent, if it's a child, or at the request of the adult, inactivate a case. That means that it'll no longer be assigned to a service coordinator. There will no longer be an annual review of the IPP. All it takes is a phone call from the individual or the parent to say, you know, we're not getting any services, but we know Johnny's case is open to you guys. We now need respite. We need out-of-home placement. And the case will be activated again, assigned to a service coordinator, and the whole process of IPP. Yeah, so there can be years. The case is never closed. The only time a case would be closed is under the regulations if the original eligibility determination was made in error. The case could be closed. But otherwise, the case is open, might be inactive, can be open for the rest of that person's life. Yep.
Any other questions over here?
I read in the manual for the land terminator that clients or a client's family member become their service coordinator. Would you recommend that?
There's not a whole lot of regional centers that are doing that anymore. There is a, in fact, I'm not sure I've seen, there was years ago some case management that was done by family, but what's happening now is what's called self-determination. And it's been coming for a long time. It's referred to as self-directed services or self-determination. And it is another Medicaid waiver program. We talked about the one DDS waiver program, but there's a new program that's being rolled out to all of the regional centers. There's a certain number of families that have been selected across the state to participate in self-directed or self-determination services. And that's where the family is given a pot of money, and they control that budget and can purchase services for their family member out of that pot of money. And that pot of money, the amount in that pot of money is determined by what did the regional center spend on that consumer the year prior. That becomes the pot of money. There has to be an intermediate, a fiduciary that actually handles the money, and if you don't have to use vendors of the regional center. You can hire anyone you want to do a service, and they're paid for with that money through a financial fiduciary intermediary. And so that's what's being piloted right now at all of the regional centers, and in the next few years it's going to be rolled out to all families. but there was an actual drawing. Regional centers across the state invited families who wanted to be considered for the self-directed services to put their name in a hat, and they literally were pulled out of the hat, and those families are now participating or will be participating in the self-determination services. I think we've got one back there.
I'm just following up on inactivating a case.
Mm-hmm.
What's the process to reactivate?
A phone call. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Just to follow up on the prior question about inactivating a case and reactivating it, it only takes a phone call to reactivate the case.
Okay, so now we're going to take some of the questions from the chat box.
Okay, the question is, the person on the phone or on the computer says they have an adult child. They want to know whether the school district would have other records besides their IEP in their files that the parent would not have.
Wow. Well, you mean not have available to request? Not that I'm aware of. I don't think there's any secret files. I mean, what would happen when you apply for services from the regional center? If it's an adult, they sign a release. If it's a child, the parent signs the release, and records are sent to all possible sources, whether that be hospitals or psychologists or school districts or CCS or whatever, and all the records that the school district would have would be forwarded on to the regional center to use in determining eligibility. I don't know of any like secret files or files that the parents wouldn't have access to. That I'm not aware of that.
Okay. Another question is, what procedure to compel another regional center to make a referral to CCS so our child moves there close to friends?
To compel another regional center, I'm not sure I'm understanding. Okay, CCS, let's back up. In order to receive services from CCS, California Children's Services, it doesn't take a referral from a regional center. The family just goes right to CCS. So I'm not sure why you would need to compel another regional center to make a referral to CCS. So
Follow-up was the other regional center has not responded for 2 months.
You're only served by the regional center in the catchment area that you reside. You can't shop for regional centers. I mean, if you move to another regional center catchment area, your IPP follows you, but you can't ask another regional center to do anything for you. You've got to work with the regional center that you reside in their catchment area.
All right, we're going to take another question from the audience. Okay.
So, in the area that I reside, VTA doesn't run on Saturday or Sundays, and there's no bus, and let's say the family's not interested in becoming a vendor. Is that a situation where the regional center would then use their taxi for vendoring?
Well, again, not on a long-term basis. The regional center has private transportation vendors that they can use. They sometimes can reimburse family members for transportation. In some of the rural areas that I mentioned, for instance, like in, let's say, Kern County, many times the parents have to be reimbursed to transport the individual, or somebody else is reimbursed at whatever rate the regional center can pay for that. But the example I gave of taxis, as I said, was a very short-term emergency basis. You're not going to find the taxi on an ongoing basis.
When a service is specified in an IPP, and in your geographic area, you can't find a service provider to provide the service. And, we hear over and over that day programs are closing and residential options are, group homes are closing. What are the options when you have a lovely service specified in a perfect IPP and it doesn't exist? And I'll just add on a comment, and that is there's a lot of cherry picking that goes on. There are programs that pick and choose who they're going to serve, and people that are more difficult to serve are not served.
Yeah,
You know where I'm going with this.
yeah, two questions, two very good questions. I'll do the second part first. Regional centers depend upon, as I say, hundreds and hundreds of vendors that they use. They don't control those vendors except to the extent that the vendor has to meet the certain regulations and submit the program designs and accept the rates. Regional centers cannot dictate to a service provider who they're going to receive, who they're going to accept. And what it might be cherry picking to one person is choosing individuals that are compatible to someone else. Like if you run a board and care home, you have an empty bed, and there are two people to a bedroom, you want to be sure that the consumer coming in is going to be a good match with the consumer that's already there. It's not cherry picking, it's just, you know, making sense. So the regional centers do not have control over who the vendors accept. Sometimes they talk about vendor waiting lists. Well, vendor waiting lists don't mean a whole lot. You know, you say, well, I'll get on the list with this vendor. Well, the vendor doesn't have to take the person that comes to the top. In other words, the person that's been on that list the longest. The vendor can take, again, whoever they feel is most appropriate and that they can meet that consumer's needs. They don't want to take in a consumer, let's say it's a behavioral issue, a behavioral day program or whatever, and they just don't have the staff to be able to handle that consumer. They can, you know, go down further on the list and pick somebody else. As far as when there's no resources, the regional center doesn't have a whole lot of tricks in their bag except to look at alternate ways of meeting the consumer's needs. For instance, if there's not a day program, maybe you look at PA, personal assistance. Maybe you look at tailored day services. Maybe you look at some other alternatives. But that all has to be done, and that's many times when families call me and I become involved. And again, we call for an IPP meeting because that's where everything happens. Call for an IPP meeting. Usually some people higher up in the organization can be there and we can really brainstorm. Okay, we don't have a vendor that can meet, you know, what's in the IPP. Let's look at another way to meet that need in a creative way. But the regional center really is at the mercy of the vendors that are in the community. And you're right, with the reimbursement rates, there are vendors that are going out of business.
Okay, I have a follow-up from the last question.
Yeah.
The question was not CCS, it was Community Care Facility.
Oh, Community Care License Facility.
Yes.
And so the question now is?
Well, it's the same question, but I think the question was, what procedure to compel another regional center to make a referral to CCF so our child moves there close to friends?
Yeah.
The other regional center has not responded for 2 months.
Now I understand the question.
Okay.
And that does happen. When CCF stands for Community Care License Facility, as I assume what they're going after there. All the residential facilities that regional center place consumers into are licensed through the Department of Social Services Community Care Licensing. And sometimes the residential facility that you find or the regional center might find is in another regional center's catchment area. The regional center in that other catchment area usually is pretty possessive of the openings that occur in their area. So the regional centers the execs at the 21 regional centers made the agreement that you're not going to place somebody into a board and care home in another regional center's area. You're going to work through the regional center. So there's sometimes when there has to even be what's called statewide searches for beds in residential facilities, and there'll be, you know, an email that'll be shotgun out to all 21 regional centers saying, hey, I've got a consumer with these needs. Are there any regional centers, or do you have any beds out there that meets this consumer's needs? If I'm the regional center accepting that, receiving that email, I may have a bed, but I'm not going to tell the other regional center about it because I know tomorrow one of our consumers is probably going to need that bed. So I know of no way to compel that other regional center to force or to make the referral to that residential facility. Usually what happens is there's a little bit of horse trading that goes on between execs. Hey, I'll accept this one this time, and you remember next time when I need one that you'll accept one. And so there can be that. But there's, as far as I know, there's nothing in regulation that can compel that other regional center to make the referral.
We have another question over here.
I wanted to ask about what is the regional center procedure on breaches of confidentiality? I'm asking specifically, just as a consumer had an ILS agency, I guess fill out an assessment, and then this assessment ended up on a public website online. Yes, I'm wondering what I can do in this situation. I guess just to feel more comfortable with doing work with like ILS vendors and regional center vendors.
Well, certainly information under HIPAA, which is what regional centers are subject to, should not be shared without the permission of the consumer in writing. So I don't know if what your recourse is. I don't know if it's through civil action. But no, your information. In fact, when there's a consideration for a referral to a vendor, whether it be ILS or residential, the consumer or the adult, if it's an adult, unconserved adult, or if it's a child, the parent or the consumer has to sign a release saying, yes, my information can be released to that vendor. And the staff is trained on that. I mean, we would have staff trainings regularly where we would remind our service coordinators of the HIPAA laws and the requirement that there could be no disclosure of confidential information without the written authorization from the consumer or their representative.
Yeah, just keep it really.
So, you said that you would want to start at a lower level for the appeal process. Like we wouldn't jump the gun for an IPP and go straight to you. We would start.
Well, I work. That's what I was saying was I work at that lowest level at the IPP. That's where I feel that issues should be resolved, so we don't have to go to an appeal.
But so would you then consider yourself an advocate?
Yes, I am.
So if somebody's new to the regional center and they're just starting out with an IPP, would they go to you to advocate for them to help set up that?
If there's an issue, I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of consumers that are getting services very effectively without any assistance from an advocate. But if there's some issues in regards to receiving those services, then an advocate can many times be very helpful. And again, at the IPP level is where I usually become involved. I attend the IPP meeting.
Would you be willing to attend an IPP meeting if it's just to maybe show a family how it works?
Yeah, and in fact, that's an interesting point because sometimes the families will say, well, if we have an advocate there, it's going to look like we're being adversarial with the regional center, and they're not going to like that. I have found that the regional centers many times appreciate the fact I'm there because I can turn to the family and I can say, what the regional center is telling you is the truth. They're not pulling the wool over your eyes, or they're not telling you something that isn't in. And so the regional center will thank me for that because I can be somewhat of an intermediary and a facilitator so that there can be real focus on what really can be done and not get hung up on issues that just are wasting time and spinning wheels. So I can facilitate. Many times in the role of a facilitator in those IPP meetings, and the regional centers don't see me necessarily as the enemy.
Okay, I have a question. What is the process to do institutional deeming, and who makes the decision? My child is 17 months old.
Very good question, and I left that out. Institutional deeming under the DDS waiver that we talked about, that's where you make a child eligible for Medi-Cal even though the parent's income and resources are too high, can only be done when the regional center consumer has been accepted for over 3 services. And that's what's called status 2. So an infant at 17 cannot be institutionally deemed. Gotta wait till they're 3 years old and have been found eligible for Lanterman services, that's over the age of 3. The waiver is only for consumers of the regional center under the Lanterman Act, age 3 and above, and who are I forgot this part too. They must be receiving a service from the regional center in order to be on the DDS waiver, and that usually is respite. We've even had, it even can be a med alert bracelet. The regional center can be paying for a med alert bracelet, and that's sufficient to meet the requirement that the regional center be providing one service. But it can't do it at 17 months. It has to be in status 2, which is over the age of 3.
Another question right here.
Yeah, just wanted to come back to a question I was asking about breach of confidentiality.
Mm-hmm.
I understand that that each regional center has, I think, an attorney that handles some kind of legal matters. I just wanted to know if I would be able to request a copy of like any reports they have regarding breaches of confidentiality that I brought up to them regarding like vendors' assessments.
Well, you certainly, as a regional center consumer, you have a right to ask for your record, your complete record from the regional center. Now, they won't necessarily run a copy of it. You know, if it's this thick, they're not necessarily going to run a copy of it and mail it to you or put it on a disc. But what we used to do is we'd set a room aside. Consumer, the family member can come in. We'd provide them the file, and then we'd copy anything that they want out of the file. So you have a right to that, and that might be a way to get at whether or not something's been disclosed that shouldn't be disclosed. As far as each of the regional centers having an attorney, we didn't have an attorney on staff. Most regional centers don't have an attorney on staff, but they do contract with an attorney primarily to assist them in the formal fair hearings where it's in front of an administrative law judge. I don't think that attorney would be involved unless they needed to become involved in any sort of breach of confidentiality. But getting your record would be an important right that you have of the regional centers to get your complete record. That complete record could indicate whether or not something went on that shouldn't have gone on.
We had a doctor prescription for certain services, and the services have not been written in the IPP.
What services in particular?
Executive functioning coaching and speech therapy services for an adult.
Okay. The regional centers will usually not do speech therapy. The thinking is that speech therapy is a therapy that the individual benefits from when they're a child and in school. If the person's still in school, then that would be the responsibility of education to do that. I've not heard of executive functioning training, so I'm not exactly even sure what that would look like or what vendor the regional center would use for that sort of thing. So I'm really not familiar with that.
Do you have any information that deep dives into IPPs and how the parent should prepare for it?
Yes. Disability Rights California is a great website to go to online. Used to be called Protection and Advocacy. Disability Rights California. They've got publications on everything. Your IPP, preparing for the IPP, just that's the resource I would suggest.
Disability Rights
California. Great website.
Yes. Back to, I think it's another follow-up on the CCF. If child pays privately for first month to move to community care facility in a different catchment, does this immediately make her a client?
If it's a child, the regional center that serves that child is where the parents reside. So if the child is placed, even privately, by the parents into another regional center's catchment area, into a board and care home, that child is still a consumer of the regional center where the parents reside.
All right, I think we're going to take one more question from the audience.
This goes back to what they were saying.
Yeah.
I know that the Silicon Valley independent living area offer certain classes, and then there's a brain injury that place that his name I can't think of right now, but they do speech therapy and they vendor with the regional center. I can look on my phone later and get you guys that information.
Great resource.
Thank you.
Would it be possible for the few questions that didn't make it right now, could they email you?
Yeah, that'd be fine. My email address, all my contact information is on this slide here, so please feel free if you've got any follow-up questions to contact me, or if I can be of assistance.
Okay, well, anyway, we finally have run out of time here. So anyway, I think you can see Jim's talent and all the knowledge he shared with us. Jim, I want to thank you so much
Certainly.
for everything you've done and all that. I do want to emphasize, part of this, and I think you'd agree with this, this is not an area where you start off by trying out to hire an attorney and that kind of thing. It's
Right.
really one of those things that we try to work with regional center. In fact, there are very few attorneys who do this sort of work.
Yeah.
Here, just a couple of questions here, just as we finish up. A couple of things with this. Do you feel solidly that the regional center will always be around? Is there any danger that something might happen like in every other state where we end up with waiting lists and that kind of thing? And then the suggestion, of course I wouldn't ask the question if I didn't know the answer. What can families and consumers do to try to make sure that this very special program we have continues?
Yeah, and I think that is what's going to keep the program going. There's, I think, it must be 250,000 people that are served now by the regional center. If you tried to start a program like this now in a state, you'd never be able to do it. The regional centers, their total budget is over $3 billion. So if you went to any state, or even California, if we didn't have a regional center system and said, we'd like to start a program, it's going to cost $3 billion, you would not start it. So we are just fortunate that back in the 60s, when Frank Lanterman agreed to do a couple of pilots, that this occurred. I can't imagine that there would be any way that this could ever be undone, or that actually the federal dollars seem to continue to be flowing out through into states through the Medicaid waiver programs that I've mentioned, two of them, the self-determination and the DDS waiver. So those dollars continue to flow. But it will be through advocacy of the parents and the consumers that would keep this going if it was ever in danger.
Right. And then maybe the last thing we might mention, I think you mentioned something that I think is really important. I think a lot of us look at the regional center as some state agency with a bunch of bureaucrats, not that we don't like bureaucrats, here that are not beholden to the constituents. Can you tell us a little bit about the regional center board, and,
Yes.
and also is there any value in attending a board meeting from time to time?
Good questions. I didn't have a slide on that, and I should have. The regional centers, as I mentioned, are private nonprofit corporations. So each of the regional centers have their own board of directors, and by regulation, that has to be populated by a representation of all of the disabilities. So there has to be family members or individuals with cerebral palsy, with intellectual disabilities, with autism, with under 5th category. There has to be a vendor on the regional center board. So they're very much community-based boards. And yes, go to those board meetings. Each of the boards have committees. Go to those committee meetings. Get on the board of each of those board of directors. While the regional centers are subject to the Welfare and Institutions Code and the Lanterman Act, there still can be some differences between regional centers, and that can be reflected through their board of directors and the input that you could provide at that level. So, and you can go online and you can read the minutes of the board meetings. You can see what's going on with that particular regional center and what their issues are. So I would strongly recommend. They have consumer advice. They have a subcommittee of the board that's just made up of consumers, and the consumers have a lot of opportunity to have input to the board of directors. So I would strongly recommend that. Good question, Steve.
Okay. Well, anyway, and I would encourage. These are our programs here. Not that we don't have disagreements with the regional centers from time to time, but this is one of those things that if you're not happy with it, you should attend regional centers. Be careful, you could find yourself on one of those boards here. But without that participation and the community participation, this whole program's going to fail. with that, we have come to the end of our hour and a half. Jim, once again, I always learn things whenever you do a presentation.
Great.
A little push here for the Golden State Pool Trust series here. This is a series of programs for attorneys and trustees here, but it's also something that should be useful to all family members. If you're interested in being on our mailing list and getting more information about this, you should email amy@gspT.org. I want to thank you all. We will have this up on the internet before too long. And anyway, our next program is on, what are we doing? Our next program, is on the ABLE Act, okay? So anyway, that certainly is a new thing, and with that, happy advocating.